Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. K. Kerber, May Broadbeck Professor in the College of Liberal Arts at Iowa, is one of the nation's leading historians of women. Not only is she a published scholar and writer, she is an outstanding teacher. In '93, she won a Regents Award for Excellence in Teaching. In '96, she received the U of I Honors Program Faculty Award. As one of her graduate students remarked, and I quote, "She's incredibly energetic, and it's clear she cares a lot. She exposes her students to everything new in the field," end quote. She came to Iowa City in 1971 and taught one of the first courses in women's studies at the University of Iowa. Professor Kerber went on to write and/or edit 7 books, received fellowships in the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Guggenheim Foundation. In '96, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the next year named a Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar. Most recently, she received a Radcliffe Award for Distinguished Academic Scholarship in the areas of knowledge related to women, gender, and society. Professor Kerber grew up in New York City. Her father trained as a lawyer, managed a camera store, and was a serious amateur photographer. Her mother taught in the public schools. Linda studied at Barnard, received a doctorate from Columbia in 1968. She holds an honorary doctorate from Grinnell College. She's taught at Yeshiva University, San Jose State College, and Stanford University before becoming an associate professor in the U of I History Department in '71 and full professor in '75. Kerber has also been a visiting professor at the University of Chicago. Her most recent published books are Women of the Republic, Intellect and Ideology in Revolutionary America, Toward an Intellectual History of Women, essays by Linda Kerber, and No Constitutional Right to be Ladies, Women and the Obligations of Citizenship in American History. She and her husband, Dr. Richard Kerber, raised 2 sons in Iowa City, Ross and Justin. Welcome to One of a Kind.
I'm delighted to be here, Ellen.
I said in my introduction that you went to Barnard, and at that time, did you have any significant role models?
Well, Barnard was a wonderful place to be a young woman student in those days. I was there in the 50s when a lot of colleges were sending a signal to young women that they should study hard while they were at college, but not expect to carry what they had learned on into the outside world. And Barnard had a different philosophy, which I would sum up as, "We are not wasting our time with you, young ladies. Go out and make the world better." And that was a very strong message. And the president of Barnard, Millicent McIntosh, was a formidable leader in women's education. And the institution was full of faculty members, men as well as women, who took us seriously, took our ideas seriously, and in some ways it made all of themselves role models for what you could try to do in the future.
Did that carry on into Columbia, too, urging you to go out and do your thing?
Well, Columbia was a different sort of place.
Uh-huh.
Columbia, I think, was ambivalent about its women graduate students in those days. It accepted a substantial number of women graduate students, so I never felt strange. But virtually all of its faculty was male. They were they didn't have a lot of confidence that their women students were going to have serious careers. And I think in some level they were a bit surprised when so many of them did.
And when after you left Columbia, you taught at...
I taught at a women's college. I taught at Stern College for Women, which was the Women's College of Yeshiva University. And so that was a small and in some ways protected environment where, again, like Barnard, it was comfortable for women to be serious thinkers, to try to push at the margins of what was known, and was a very good starting experience for me.
When you came to Iowa City, was the university kind of progressive and ahead of their times to hire you and your husband? Because you both were a package in a way.
Yeah, we were. We would not have come to Iowa City separately, and the
Thank
university...
Way to go, Iowa!
Well, Dick was recruited first by the cardiology division at the hospital, where he has happily been a professor of cardiology ever since we've come. And Iowa was extraordinary in those days for being comfortable with the idea that it was a reasonable thing to think about, possibility of hiring spouses. And that didn't mean that all academic couples got hired, but it did mean that when Dick said, well, if I'm to consider this job, we have to consider the possibility of Linda coming as a historian, the history department took my candidacy very seriously, and I was very flattered that they were so responsive and receptive. So we were both welcomed.
Were there many other women in academics at that time teaching in a tenure track?
No, the last woman in the department had been Rosalie Coley, I believe, a historian of England who had gone to Brown and was no longer there. And so when I came, I was the only tenure track woman in the department. I got tenure a year or two later. It was very clear that many women were earning PhDs in their various specialties. I think something like 20% of the PhDs in history were going to women, but 20% of the new hires in history were not women. And I've lived my whole career in a context in which we have said, well, if you're making intellectual judgments about hiring, then gender, race, ethnicity, and so forth should not be part of what goes into the hiring decision.
Well, tell me about Iowa City in the 70s, because this is about local history too, and lots of things were happening. There was this energy erupting in Iowa City. Why? Why here? Why at that time?
That I don't know, but I do know that Iowa City was an extraordinarily energetic place in 1971. Part of it was, there was a downside to that energy. Part of it was a response to the Vietnam War. A good deal of it came out of a very vigorous anti-war movement and a concern that universities not be complicit in supporting the war by their research or by their welcome to military recruitment and so forth. And so some of the energy was a frightened energy. We were all very frightened. But in that fear, we also, I think a lot of people had a sense that they could change the world, that people working together could make a difference, that they could work collectively for social change. And the university had as its president when I came Sandy Boyd, who felt that down to the tips of his toes and the edges of his hair. And that, I think some of that energy was very much part of the university community.
And there was the Emma Goldman Clinic, wasn't it started about that time? And Title IX and debate on abortions, all happening here.
The Emma Goldman Clinic is one of the oldest freestanding women's health centers established in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade, and it is It is a center of national significance, which I don't think is really appreciated here in Iowa City, but it's appreciated nationally. It was a trailblazer in what it undertook to do. The university was, as an institution, very receptive to the addition of women's studies courses. I used to say that when I offered to teach a course in U.S. women's history, which would have been the first regular course in women's history, there had been one in the antecedent to the Saturday and evening class program, which was then called the Free University, and had an agenda of raising the possibilities of new courses and new studies. And that course in women's history had been taught by a young graduate student. But I offered to teach the first regular course in U.S. women's history in 1972, I believe, and all over the country, my colleagues in other institutions were making the same proposal. And all over the country, there were curriculum committees that were saying, we don't believe this is a serious subject. And all over the country, they were fighting bureaucratic battles of great length and force and nastiness. And here at the University of Iowa, the chair of my department, Sidney James, simply asked, well, do you want to teach on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday and Thursday?
That's great. Oh, and when you walked in to that class, was it kind of, was there electricity in it?
There was. It was extraordinary.
Do you remember that first day?
I do. Casey Mahan, who now is back at the law school, was a student in that first class, and sometimes we talk about it. She was a wonderful student, and there must have been 150, maybe easily 150 students in it. And we all had a sense that we were doing something truly novel. People said to me, well, will you have enough to fill up a whole semester?
Oh, okay.
And I wasn't sure. I really wasn't sure. And remember, of course, there weren't quite so many books out in paperback, and we weren't sure how much we could sustain. But that first semester went very, very fast, and by the end, we were scurrying to fill things up. To
get
things into the time. And within 2 years, I think, the survey course in U.S. women's history had expanded to 2 semesters, and I'm game to expand it to 3 if anybody wants to help. I think I've been lucky enough to be part of a generation that has seen an absolute explosion of knowledge and understanding of the ways in which men and women have participated in the making of the past, which is kind of breathtaking in its range and seriousness.
And didn't you not write the first kind of textbook that classes across the United States are using?
Well, it was one of the early ones. I wouldn't say it was first. In fact, it's not first. But it has been a popular one, and the story of women's America, which is actually not a bad story. In fact, I should have brought copies of the first edition and the fourth edition, because what happened was that in the late 1970s, teachers were saying, well, there is a lot of stuff out there, we understand that, but it's hard to find. And an editor at Oxford University Press said, Jane DeHart, who was then teaching at University of North Carolina, asked us if we'd like to try to put together an anthology. And again, we weren't so sure that there was going to be enough to sustain a really good book. And we did put together an anthology. And at the end, we put 10 or 15, I think 15 legal documents that related to women. There were court decisions, there were legislation. And the idea was that we would put in very dense and difficult things, because lots of people were saying that women's history was a fad and it was going to go away. And we thought, well, maybe it will go away, but you will always have to learn Minor versus Happersett, and you will always have to learn Bradwell versus Illinois, and you will always have to learn the text of the Equal Rights Amendment of the Civil Rights Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And you will have to learn these things, and we're going to put them in and make them very, very serious. By now, this book is now in its 5th edition. It is much fatter and bigger. I mean, the heft of it is just larger. And for the first time, we are in the new edition that's coming out next year, we are filtering the legal documents through the book in a gradual way, putting them where they belong in the time frame, because we don't feel any longer we have to make that kind of defensive move that suggests that women's history has to be defended.
But isn't your field changing rapidly? Didn't you say someplace that something I read that it's changing almost as fast as like biochemistry?
I mean,
you did say that. Well, give me an example. Like new texts are being found, or what's happened?
Well, I'll tell you where that example came from. There was a little conference here some years ago that was initiated actually by Professor McCluskey. And one of the visitors to the conference had offered a paper, and we were all sitting around making comments and helping her think about ways in which she could improve the paper before the papers of the conference were published. And at some point, quite innocently, I said, well, you know, you make such and such a point. I don't even remember what it was that she said. I said, you say such and such, and your footnote, your source on which you rely, is an article which was published 18 months ago. And in the interim, in these last 18 months, a new book has come out, Margaret Rossiter's Women Scientists in America, and it has undermined the argument of that article, and you can no longer say that. And you got to change it. And at this point, Professor McCluskey banged the hand on the table and said, wait a minute, Linda, did I hear you say that an article that is 18 months old, a historical article, can't be used because it's out of date? And I said, yeah. And McCluskey said, what field do you think you're in? Biochemistry?
Oh, is that where it came from?
Yes.
Oh, it's a great
so
story.
Ever since, I have figured that women's history is biochemistry. It has changed very rapidly. There's been great energy. Many people have worked on a wide range of subjects. We have made a difference in the way you think about labor history. We made a difference in the way you think about constitutional history. We made a difference in the way people think about intellectual history, because all these histories had been written as though women never really worked, never really thought a thought, never really made a significant difference in the world. And none of those generalizations hold anymore.
Are 90%, 95% of history written by men?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. Certainly when I came into the field with a new PhD, there were major institutions in this country in which the history departments were 100% male. In fact, that's how my consciousness got raised. I started looking at, we were organizing a group of women historians on the West Coast when we lived in California, and I got to look up the names of women historians, and I looked at the catalogs of many history departments at UCLA and Berkeley and the University of Washington and the University of Oregon, and they were literally 50-man history departments. Women had been writers of history, and in the 1920s and 1930s there were a substantial proportion of academic historians were women, and always a substantial proportion of amateur and popular historians were women. Think of Barbara Tuchman.
I was just thinking Barbara Tuchman, yes.
Yeah. So that if you didn't need the institutional support and you lived near good libraries, it was possible. But I actually have found myself thinking that the reason for the dearth of women historians in the generation before ours is less than the idea that women didn't want to do history than it is that during the Cold War there was a lot of suspicion of the professional woman, as the activist woman, and universities, which in the past had given fellowships to women, stopped giving fellowships to women. The idea was that they were to marry and have children and simultaneously forego the thought of a career.
That's a big change, isn't it? And when you graduated, because you were expected to not undermine the assumptions that people had for you to marry and maybe have children, but now, do your graduate students, do they feel that pressure if they happen to be women?
I think they feel other kinds of pressure. I mean, I think now they do understand, and the signals are very clear that they should expect to be self-sustaining in life. But they don't have much more institutional support for, whether they're men or women, for the kind of social structures that would make it reasonable to try to have a family and a career at the same time. You know, Thurgood Marshall once said that one of the great challenges of our generation will be to make it as easy for a woman to be a mother and have a profession as it is for men to be fathers and have professions. And I think that's a goal we should be focusing on.
Do you think that's the challenge of this generation?
I do. I really do.
You said that every generation has kind of their issues, or what they can't solve all the problems, you said, but they've got a responsibility to move things ahead. So maybe this is that generation's issue for them. One of them.
I think it is. I think it's a big one. And I think that solving it will involve solving a lot of other big issues. One of the reasons that it's been, I mean, there are deeply rooted economic reasons why it's been so hard for women to simultaneously be parents and have professions or have jobs or have careers. And some of those structural reasons are that we live in a world which regularly pays women less than men. So that if I had a single thing to leverage, if there was a single thing I wanted to change in the next 30 years, I would say we need to end the feminization of poverty. And if we could assume that men and women had an equal economic chance in life, then I think they would use that economic equality to sustain equal health care, equal educational opportunities, and ultimately equal job and professional opportunities.
Let's talk about. I hope you can do it. In the next
I can't do it. I can't do it.
People
this
behind
is a big
you.
agenda.
Yes, it's the generation behind you
Yeah.
and behind that generation. I'd love to talk about. Before I ask you about your book, this Rights and Obligations and this battles for full participation in our society, how you're a teacher, you do research, you must travel a lot. How do you keep this balance? I mean, it must be tricky.
It's very difficult.
Yeah,
it's very difficult. One element in it is that Dick and I figured out a long time ago that that there were costs. There are sort of costs of maintaining a professional life that are substantial, and that at the moment are only partially tax deductible, but we would have to pay them in any case. And so when our children were little, we had a lot of child care, and we lived more modestly than our incomes might have suggested. For a long time we didn't have a television set, but we did have a housekeeper, so that we could support it. The ability to maintain a demanding professional life requires a lot of supports. And I've had some of that, and come to depend on some of that. So that's one part of it. Another part is that a life that involves teaching and research and travel and writing is an exciting life. and there's energy that comes with that, and new ideas.
It feeds you. It
yes.
feeds you.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. So I've been very lucky. I've been very, very lucky.
I can tell by your face it just excites you, this whole process you're in. And I want to talk about this book that has got a lovely review in the New York Times.
Yes, thank you.
And for people who are not familiar with coverture and this whole legal principle, could you expand about this? I think it's fascinating.
Oh, thank you, Ellen. Well, you know, writers love to talk about their books.
Do it.
So this is a dangerous question.
That's okay. I think it's most interesting.
But I've been, as I've said, very interested in uncovering and learning about the history of women in the United States and elsewhere. And the history that we've inherited is one which in many ways is a very optimistic history. It tells us about rights. It's the way Americans write our history in any case. We tell American history as the story of claims for rights, the expansion of rights. As time goes on, more people get the right to vote, more people get the right to travel, and so forth. And this is one of the great, I think, exciting aspects, progressive aspects of American history and the American past. Well, the reverse of rights is obligations. Mm-hmm. And I thought it would be interesting to look at the American past through the prism of obligations and ask, what are the obligations which the state has required of people? Mm-hmm. Now, everybody knows that the history of suffrage, let's say, is a braided narrative, that you don't say Americans get the right to vote on such and such a day. You say, in the Revolutionary era, white men with property got the right to vote, and then later white men without property get the right to vote, and you tell the story of voting all the way to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So people understand it's gradual, but they don't understand, and I didn't understand until I wrote this book, that the history of obligation was also complicated, and that the ways in which obligations to the state have been demanded have varied on whether you are a man or a woman, white or black, married or unmarried. Mm-hmm. So that's what I explore in this book. It has seemed to me that in addition to the general obligation to obey the law, which we all have, and which is such a big topic, I didn't know how to, how to deal with it. There are 5 very specific obligations that the state demands of us and punishes us if we don't fulfill. Mm-hmm. And most of the time we live our lives blissfully innocent of this, except taxes. Everybody complains about taxes.
Yes.
But I think there are 5 obligations. There is the obligation to refrain from treason, and that rests only on citizens. There is the obligation to pay taxes, which rests on everyone, citizen or not citizen, who lives in the United States. And also an obligation to military service, which can be demanded of non-citizens who live in the United States. There is an obligation to serve on juries, which is a citizen's obligation, but in a few jurisdictions they demand it of alien residents. And then there's a final obligation, which is a rather odd one. You don't have an obligation to work if you inherit a lot of money. The state doesn't care whether you work or not. But you have a funny obligation to look as though you're working, to appear to be an upstanding working citizen. And you don't know that you haven't fulfilled this obligation until you're standing around on a street corner and a cop grabs you by the shoulder and says, "You look like a vagrant. Come with me, I'm arresting you as a vagrant." So you have a kind of negative obligation to appear to be working, a negative obligation not to be a vagrant. And in this book, I try to persuade people that these obligations, which rest on all Americans, have had a different history for men and women, and in some cases, as in the obligation to refrain from vagrancy, a different history for men and women of different races. Let me give you one example of how one of these could work for men or women. Taxation is the general obligation.
Sure.
Everybody knows that they're taxed. Well, in 1873, on the 100th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, two well-to-do, not very wealthy, but they had property, two single elderly women in Glastonbury, Connecticut, outside of Hartford, listening to the stories of how true Americans fought the British 100 years before, dumped the tea in Boston Harbor, said no taxation without representation. They said, well, we guess we're not represented. We would like to vote. We would like to vote at town meetings so we could be part of the decision about where the roads could go. They had a farm, and everybody knows farmers care about roads. And their tax money went to pay for roads, and they wanted to have a voice in where that money was spent, and they didn't feel they were represented. And they said, well, if it's no taxation without representation, I guess we won't pay taxes. So they don't pay their taxes. So the sheriff comes and detains their cows and marches the cows off to the crossroads and sells them. I mean, auctions them off for back payment of taxes. And Abby and Julia Smith, who have a stunning sense of street theater, get into a buggy and they follow their cows down the road, and they sit there in their buggy glaring at the people who have come to buy the cows. And this kind of theater is repeated for 6 or 7 years. They don't win, but they travel. I mean, they give speeches in New York, and they testify before congressional committees, and they are quite extraordinary folks. And by the 1880s, there are tax treatises that are written by lawyers and judges, which say, some people think that taxation is linked to representation. Taxation is a factor of state sovereignty and state power, which in fact is what it is.
Just a little aside, how did you find out the story? Were these diaries? Did they keep diaries?
Well, actually,
journals?
At the time, this was a very famous story.
It was written up in the paper?
It was written up in the papers. Reporters came from all over. And in fact, it was part of a national women's tax protest, which, again, fell out of the history books until it's now restored, in which in 1873 and thereabouts, 71, 72, 73, women all over the country, and particularly in Rochester, New York, in Massachusetts, and in St. Louis, tried to tease out the implications of the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection of the laws and the theme of no taxation without representation. In St. Louis, a group of activist women demanded that the city assessor report how much money in property taxes was paid by single women in St. Louis. They found out that single women in St. Louis owned free and clear something like $14 million of property and were taxed on it. And there wasn't anything they were able to do about it, but they did announce that they saw no reason to pay taxes to pay for fireworks for the 4th of July. They thought that this was a scam. A scam.
Oh, that's a great story. I could just see your students just riveted at the end of their chairs.
It is a great story.
It is. And I didn't realize till I read about your book and the review and things about it, about the jury duty. I mean, where have I been that we weren't represented on juries, that we were to stay home?
Jury duty is very interesting because many people think of jury duty as a right.
That's right.
We have a right to sit on juries, which is true. But your real right is that if you are accused of a crime, you have a right to be tried by a jury which is drawn from the neighborhood in which the crime has been committed and from which no sector of the population has been arbitrarily excluded. So over the years there have been many tests of whether they could exclude people who earn their wages on an hourly basis as opposed to people who got monthly salaries, which would be a way of getting rid of working people and choosing only professionals. There have been many cases which tested the exclusion of people from juries on racial grounds. The exclusion of women from juries was understood to be a privilege, a gesture of permission. I am pleased to say that Iowa does not, Iowa's record on this is very good. When women got the right to vote in Iowa in 1920, jury service statutes were written in terms of electors, and so women's names were put in the jury pool. And that was true in a number of states. But in all of those states, including Iowa, the first guy who gets found guilty by a jury that has women on it appeals his conviction on the grounds that he has not been tried by 12 good men and true or a jury of his peers. And in each of those states, the state Supreme Court has to say, buddy. No, women are your peers. Except in Illinois, where the Supreme Court said, well, you have a point there. When they wrote that statute in the first place, women didn't vote. They must have met men. We need a new statute. It took 20 years before Illinois passed a statute that allowed women to serve on juries. No woman served on a jury in New York until 1937. And then when you got called for jury service, I love it, you got a little form in which you could check a box if you wanted to be excluded, an automatic exclusion. Number one was that you worked on a ship. You were actually at sea. Number two was that you were a member of a volunteer fire company and always available for emergency duty. And it sort of works its way down to number 8, which is a woman. In some states, no woman served on a jury until the 1960s and completely excluded. In Massachusetts, no woman served on a jury until 1949, and then she could be excused if she was likely to be embarrassed by anything she heard in the jury in the course of the trial or would talk about. It was
kind of a protection.
It was understood to be a protection. Well, in 1957, in Tampa, Florida, Gwendolyn Hoyt, in the course of a domestic quarrel, struck her husband with a baseball bat and killed him. And she'd done it in a fit of anger, and her lawyers wanted a jury drawn from a cross-section of the community that might include women who might understand the tensions and anxieties of domestic violence. But in Florida, in 1957, if a woman were to serve on a jury, she had to have first gone down to the county courthouse and registered her willingness to serve. So she had to sign up on a register. And you can imagine how many people trooped down to the Hillsborough County Courthouse, 248. So when they drew a jury pool of 3,000 men's names, they only had available 248 women, and the clerk of court only put in 10, on the grounds that 10 was a nice round number. And it was no surprise then that the jury pool from which her jury was drawn was composed almost completely of men's names, that her actual jury was all male. Her lawyers appealed on the grounds that it wasn't an authentic cross-section of the community. They lost in the state Supreme Court, and they lost in the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was Earl Warren was Chief Justice. It was a liberal, progressive court who, with only a slight change in members, had some years before voted for Brown versus Board of Education. There's a wonderful moment in that trial in which before the U.S. Supreme Court, in which the Attorney General for the state of Florida says, well, the reason women are not on the juries is because of their infirmities. And on the tape, you hear the deep voice of Earl Warren saying, just what infirmities do you have in mind? This is 1961. Just what infirmities do you have in mind? And you actually hear the lawyer for Florida sputtering into the tape. He says, excuse me, Mr. Chief Justice, I misspoke myself. I only meant they have to cook the dinners. And what he was speaking to, which sounds frivolous on the face of it, but I think is dead serious deep down, is a very old assumption in Anglo-American law that at marriage, the husband gains control of the wife's body, her property, and her will. And indeed, she had to cook his dinner because, in fact, she lived in service to him. And he, the old assumption was, he stood for her between the family and the public sector.
And that's what we call coverture?
And that's what we call coverture. His civic identity covered hers. She came under his cover so long as they were married. What that meant was that you start with the assumption that he has access to her body physically. It's quite ugly, a little assumption. There is no concept of marital rape in this country until 1975. And if he has access to her body, then it seemed quite logical that he should control her property. He could always blackmail her. He could always kind of push her around. And of course you wouldn't give a married woman a vote because her husband could control her will too easily. And to give her a vote would simply give him 2 votes. And elements of that old pattern in family law in which the husband controls the wife formally, and in which she owes all her obligations to her husband, have eroded over time very, very slowly.
But in 1992, didn't the Supreme Court, what was this?
Well, I would say that one way to understand the women's movement of our time has been that it has been part of the effort, an effort that Elizabeth Cady Stanton began to chip away at these old assumptions that the husband stood in for the wife in civic duty. But as late as 1961, it was considered all right by the Supreme Court for a state to make it harder for women to serve on juries and easier for men to serve on juries. It's not until 1975 that the Supreme Court rules that men's names and women's names have to be put in jury pools on the same terms, and it's not till 1992, as you say, that the Supreme Court, no, it's not till 1994 that the Supreme Court ruled that gender cannot be made a basis for peremptory challenges. It's not till 1992 that the Supreme Court rules that the whole concept that at marriage a wife is covered by her husband's civic identity, not till 1992 that they say that's old-fashioned. We will not entertain arguments on that basis. And it came before the court in an argument over it's Casey versus Planned Parenthood of Pennsylvania, and the question was, did a husband have to give permission to a wife to have an abortion? And not permission, I think it was simply that did a wife have to notify her husband that she was going to have an abortion? It was husband's notification, like parental notification. Sure. And the court was prepared to say that parental notification was reasonable, but husband's notification was not. Children came under the parents.
That was the 1992.
1992. So not until 1992 does the Supreme Court actually overrule this.
Well, I'm just sitting here, just loving it. It's like, oh my goodness, class isn't over. This is fabulous. I love it. One of my last questions is, what are you looking forward to? What's coming down the road for you? Whoa, what next for you?
For one thing, I would like the arguments of this that I make in this book, which took me easy 10 years to figure out and to write. I would like to make sure that people are persuaded of them, because I think they have something to say about to our understanding of the relationship between men and women, of the seriousness of women's history, and also of feminist politics in our own time. I think a lot of people look at contemporary efforts to change women's place in society, and they say, well, we've been trying to make changes since 1970, which is a long time, and everything's not fixed. There's still a lot of problems. I encounter some people who say feminism is an old fad, it's dead, it did its thing, and now boys take cooking in junior high, girls take shop. We've solved the problems. We've got equal pay for equal work. And to the extent that we still have problems, feminists haven't fixed them. What I learned from working on this book was that the story of social change is very difficult, that some of these elements are so deeply rooted in American law and tradition and practice that of course they're difficult to change. They're always going to be difficult to change. And that we should not expect them to be fixed in a single generation. And we should not be surprised at their difficulties. So one thing I think historians can do for us all is help us understand why some problems look so deeply rooted and are so hard to fix. They are hard to fix because they're deeply rooted. I am still interested in matters of rights and obligations. I'm thinking about issues that are somewhat more international in scope for some of my next projects. I'm concerned about an international context in which human rights and gender have played out. I looked at, just in the course of doing this, I came upon a report of the League of Nations Committee on the Status of Women just before World War II broke out. And the agenda that they had, the things they were worried about, were an agenda that looks very contemporary. They were worried about married women's independent citizenship. They were worried about disparities in literacy between women and men. They were worried about disparities in health between women and men. And they were worried about disparities in refugees' experience, where often men, as we see in the terrible war in Yugoslavia now, violence is exercised on men and women differently in different shapes. And I expect to go on to study this and learn more about it.
To be continued.
To be continued.
And this was really a privilege to have you here. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Well, you're kind to say that, Ellen. It was a privilege to be here.
My guest on One of a Kind has been Linda K. Kerber, widely considered one of the most distinguished historians in the United States. Her work as a women's history scholar, researcher, and teacher has earned her a national and international reputation. She taught the first women's history course at the U of I in 1971 and co-edited the major textbook in the field, Women's America, Refocusing the Past, an anthology. As a pioneer scholar and teacher in the area of women's history, she has received many honors, and I just mention a few. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar, President of the Organization of American Historians, Guggenheim Fellowship Award, 3 fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, U of I Honors Program Faculty Award, Regents Award of Faculty Excellence, and the Radcliffe Award for Distinguished Academic Scholarship. Iowa City and the University of Iowa are indeed fortunate that Professor Kerber chose to work and live here. Linda K. Kerber is one of a kind.